Hi, welcome back. This is topic of legitimacy, the last discussion under family law course. For the purpose of this discussion, we are going to refer to Evidence Act 1950, Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act 1976, Legitimacy Act 1961, and Adoption Act 1952. Under the common law, a child is considered legitimate if his parents are married at the time of his conception or at the time of his birth. There are instances where, although the child is conceived prior to the valid marriage, he is considered a legitimate child as he is born during a valid marriage. The presumption of legitimacy is provided under Section 112 of the Evidence Act 1950. The section states that the fact that any person was born during the continuance of a valid marriage between his mother and any man, or within 280 days after its dissolution, the mother remaining unmarried, shall be conclusive proof that he is the legitimate son of that man, unless it can be shown that the parties to the marriage had no access to each other at the time the child could have been begotten. The presumption of legitimacy under Section 112 of the Evidence Act 1950 provides that the child must be born during the continuance of a valid marriage, or within 280 days after its dissolution, is applicable, in order to prove the legitimacy of the child to a marriage. It is immaterial how soon after the marriage the child was born. The presumption of this section applies irrespective of the fact whether the mother was married or not at the time of the conception. The presumption is a rebuttable one, which can be done by showing non-access. But once access of or intercourse by the husband is proved, no evidence can be allowed to show that the child is not the child of the husband. Non-access may be proved if the parties are physically separated, or if the husband is proved to be impotent or incapacitated at the relevant point of time. There are a few important points under Section 112 of the Evidence Act 1950. First, there is a continuance of a valid marriage. Second, within 280 days after its dissolution, the mother remained unmarried. And third, the exception, where the presumption will not apply if it can be shown that the parties had no access to each other. With regard to the first point, the continuance of a valid marriage, evidence that a child is born during wedlock is sufficient to establish its legitimacy and shifts the burden of proof to the other party seeking to establish the contrary. Rafi'ah Salim in her book stated that even if a blood test were to prove positively that the child is not the child of the husband of the mother, Section 112 would nevertheless presume that the child is the legitimate child of the husband as long as the child was born during the marriage of the said husband and wife. In the case of Behada Singh and Viru, the presumption that children born of a woman during the lifetime of her husband can be fully rebutted if the woman admittedly lived for years with another person and they both asserted such children to be the offspring of the union. In another case, Ainan bin Mahmud and Syed Abu Bakar bin Habib Yusuf, the facts of this case was one Mahmud had left some property for his children living at the date of the execution of a deed of settlement. Plaintiff and Defendant 2, Defendant 3 and Defendant 4 were acknowledged sons of Mahmud. Defendant 6 was the only son of Mahmud with his wife Long Raya. Now, this Defendant 6 was born within 6 months of his father's marriage to his mother, and it was submitted to the court that Defendant 6 was illegitimate. The judge in this case had made the decision relying on Section 112 Evidence Act 1950. Defendant 6 was declared as legitimate son since he was born during the continuance of a valid marriage. In the landmark case of Ahcak and Nidam, one Hedges married his wife on 29th of May 1918. During the year 1928, Mrs. Hedges was living with her husband and children, and on 26 February 1928, she gave birth to the child mentioned in the complaint. Hedges registered the birth of the child. At the same time, there was one market gardener by the name of Ahcak who worked close to the house occupied by the Hedges, and he frequently visited their house in the absence of Mr. Hedges. The child born to Mrs. Hedges had Mongoloid features. The issues here, whether the child was illegitimate and whether Ahcak was the father of the child. It was not disputed that at or about the time the child was conceived, Hedges and his wife had opportunities of access. They were living together, and the child was therefore born during the subsistence of the marriage, and on the face of it, it was legitimate Even if it has been proved that the woman had committed adultery with the other man, the husband must be deemed to be the father of the child. The effect of legitimation is that a legitimated person shall have rights to property as if he were born legitimate. In the case of Re Law, Justice Rome stated, legitimacy is a question of status. The status of legitimacy can be obtained by being born legitimate or by being legitimated by virtue of the provision of the Act. The plaintiff had attained that status, and it is an irrelevant consideration whether she attained it in one way or the other. Moving on to the second point under Section 112, which is within 280 days after its dissolution, the mother remaining unmarried. This shall be conclusive proof that he is the legitimate son of the man. In the case of Mise Byron Prasad and Muhammad Gopi Kunwar, the Privy Council in a case from India has decided that in the absence of convincing evidence of non-access, the ordinary presumption of law is in favour of the legitimacy of a posthumous son born within a period of 280 days of the death of a man to whom his mother was united in lawful matrimony. With regard to the third point, unless it can be shown that the parties had no access to each other. Here, access means opportunity. It connotes existence and non-existence of opportunities for having sexual intercourse. Strong evidence must be adduced to show that the mother and the husband had no access to each other. For example, the husband was totally impotent or away from the mother at the time when the child would have been conceived. Our next discussion is on legitimation process. The general rule is that a child born out of wedlock is illegitimate, but according to the Legitimacy Act 1961, a child born out of wedlock may be made legitimate by statute or procedure known as the process of legitimation. There are three ways in which legitimation of children may be possible under Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act 1976, Legitimacy Act 1961, or Adoption Act 1952. Under the Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act 1976, Section 75, subsection 1 of the Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act 1976 provides that a child of a voidable marriage shall be deemed to be born legitimate, and in Section 75, subsection 2, a child of a void marriage shall be deemed to be born legitimate if, at the time of the marriage, one or both parties reasonably believe that the marriage was valid. The second option is under Legitimacy Act 1961. This is an act to provide for legitimation of children born out of wedlock. For the legitimation of child, Section 4 requires that the parent of an illegitimate child to marry one another in order to legitimize the child. Legitimation is allowed if the marriage was solemnized and registered according to either Civil Marriage Ordinance 1952, Christian Marriage Ordinance 1956, Christian Marriage Ordinance, or Marriage Ordinance of Sabah 1959, Church and Civil Marriage Ordinance of Sarawak, or Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act 1976, as stated under Section 3, subsection 1 of the Legitimacy Act 1961. Section 3, subsection 2, provides that the legitimation of a person under Legitimacy Act does not enable him or his spouse, children, or remoter issue to take any interest in property unless it is expressly provided in Legitimacy Act. And Section 5 provides for declarations of legitimacy of a legitimated person. An application should be made by petition and accompanied by affidavit verifying the facts alleged to the High Court. We have one landmark case which illustrates the legitimation process, which is the case of Lau Zan Chen and Makoto Togase. In this case, the petitioner, a male infant, was born to Lau Fat Wan, the second respondent. The birth was registered with the second respondent named as the petitioner's natural mother. The name and particulars of the father was omitted in the birth certificate because, at the time of the petitioner's birth, the natural parents were not married. However, later, they were married on 28 February 1993 and they wished to legitimize their children. The petitioner filed a petition under Section 5, subsection 1 of Legitimacy Act 1961. And in this case, the High Court granted the declaration of the legitimacy to the petitioner after accepting the evidence of blood tests, particularly conducted by one Mrs. Tan Wai Fan, where the results were that the probability of paternity was 99.7% for Makoto Togase being the biological father of the petitioner. What are the other effects of being a legitimate child under Legitimacy Act? Section 6 provides that any illegitimate child that has been legitimized under the Act shall be entitled to take interest in the property as if the legitimated child had been born legitimate. Whereas, Section 11 provides the rights of an illegitimate child and the mother of an illegitimate child to succeed on intestacy of the other, as if he had been born legitimate and she had been the only surviving parent. The last option to legitimize a child is under the Adoption Act 1952. Here, Section 9 of the Adoption Act provides for the legitimation of child by way of adoption. This section stated that, upon an adoption order being made by the court, all rights, duties, obligations, and liabilities of the parent or parents, guardian or guardians of the adopted child, in relation to the future custody, maintenance, and education of the adopted child shall vest on the adopter as though the adopted child was his biological child. We have now come to the end of discussion of the last topic. I hope you managed to understand all the points discussed and will be able to answer questions on the topic. Thank you for watching and have a good day. Assalamualaikum.